Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. Today I'm discussing the tempestuous life of a founding father, James Otis Jr. Many people don't know James Otis Jr. That's because his life, unfortunately, his political life was destroyed and cut short due to his severe mental illness. So I've titled this as the first Patriot, which I'm using in a sort of almost synonymous way with a founding father, and not exactly synonymous, but Patriot was a Patriot leader, a founding father, uh, and widely regarded as the first to have a severe mental illness because his career was destroyed in the 1770s. But a lot of his work and activities and his brilliance actually led to precipitating the embers of war, the fire, the fuel that instigated the Revolutionary War. James Otis Jr. Of course, he was born. He was born on February the fifth, 1725, and on May 23, 1783, he was struck by lightning. Literally struck by lightning while standing in the doorway of his friend's home. Yes, so you can see how tumultuous his life went. And so it ended, in a flash of lightning, unfortunately. That really happened. He was struck by lightning, and that was how he died. Um, so James Otis Jr., his father was Colonel Otis Sr., and he was a prominent colonel and a lawyer, very prominent lawyer. And he was born in Massachusetts, right? It's interesting. He didn't have a great relationship with his father. His father had actually literally written him a letter asking him uh, to seek the righteousness of God in order to better himself. So Massachusetts, of course, the Puritans went there. The early Puritans who landed in Plymouth, they were very deeply religious, and of course, that was where the Salem witch hunt, the Salem witch trials occurred. It was an irrational. Um, Deeply religious hysteria that occurred in which many innocent people were killed, as many as 25 people, and about 200 people were falsely accused by people who had nothing more than spectral evidence claiming they had these dreams, and there's all sorts of witches all around. So yes, Massachusetts was very religious at that time. So his father was a prominent lawyer. Uh, James Otis Jr. graduated from Harvard. He went to Harvard. He became a lawyer and was a very, brilliant lawyer. And as I said, he did many significant things to precipitate um, the Revolutionary War, including his famous defense uh, against the writs of assistance in the case of Paxton versus Gray in 1761. A writ of assistance um, was sort of like a court order which was given, you know, in which a sheriff or a tax collector could just enter, a colonist home without any notice, without giving them any notice, and just randomly search their house to seize anything. They just search for contraband or anything they want to find, and so they didn't have probable cause, right? So he argued against these writs of assistance, and of course, these were amongst the things that sort of angered the colonists against the British, and so he argued against the writs of assistance in and in a he gave a 5 hour screed. He did lose though. He lost, but he was praised for his arguments at that time, and they were considered very uh, cogent and full of facts, full of citations from prominent cases, and interestingly. John Adams had praised it. In fact, John Adams was a had been sort of a protege of um, had been a protege of James Otis Jr. And at least he copied his oratorical style. Of course, John Adams himself went on to be a outstanding lawyer who defended the British officers in the Boston massacre, and he got them acquitted. Right, he got all of them except one acquitted, and the one who wasn't acquitted basically got manslaughter and a slap on the wrist. But before John Adams was James Otis Jr. There's another reason why I want to talk about James Otis Jr. This is because I'm going to be talking about his decline due to severe mental illness. This is the month of April. It's not quite mental health awareness month, which is in May, but this is stress awareness and autism awareness month in April. Now, I think I misspoken and indicated that autism was a mental illness. Apparently, autism is not classified in the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual on Mental Disorders as a mental illness. It's in there, but it's not a mental illness because it's not treatable. It's a life condition and it's considered a developmental condition and neurodivergence, condition, right? So autism is not quite considered as a treatable mental illness, right? Because there's no cure for it. Um, but it does have what are called co-occurring conditions of mental illness, such as depression and anxiety. But in any event, so that's another reason why I've been discussing cases with regard to mental health. Now, with respect to the Paxton versus Gray case in 1761, in which um, uh, James Otis Jr. argued unsuccessfully against the writs of assistance. The writs of assistance, remember, it allowed a sheriff's court, sheriffs and law enforcement to just enter a colonist's house a without probable cause, without cause, and not specifying anything, specifically what they were looking for. That, of course, would inspire James Madison to include the Fourth Amendment. Again, the Fourth Amendment, then, which protects us from, the violations of a writ of assistance. So, Fourth Amendment protects Americans from unreasonable search and seizures, right? And so it requires probable cause. It says no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So the Fourth Amendment deals with the abuses of a writ of assistance, which James Otis Jr. argued against, although unsuccessfully in 1761 in Paxton versus Gray, and that, of course, was one of the things that was impetus to the Revolutionary War. But later on, there was something else. Again, he's the issue of taxation, right? Taxation that occurred from the Stamp Act uh, after the 7 Year War, right? The 7 Year War, which led to the taxation. Now, James Otis Jr., he was very prominent in the beginning. He's credited with having coined the phrase taxation without representation in parliament is tyranny, right? So no taxation without representation. He's credited with having coined that taxation without representation in parliament um, is tyranny. Importantly, he's said to have been the first American, the first colonist, the first person in the Americas to have actually uh, formulated distinctive American theories on constitutionalism and representation. Although their argument, his biographers and later critiques, they said, well, he wasn't consistent, right? He wasn't consistent, or with in his arguments, he didn't follow through in a logical manner, right? And we don't, it's possible that it was a result of his battle with mental illness. He was an alcoholic as well. It is unclear what exactly caused his mental illness. There's speculation. In 1769, he was in a violent confrontation with a British tax collector by the name of John Robinson, and he hit him with a cudgel. Right, he got hit him with a cudgel to the head, and it caused a serious gash in the head. And they attribute his mental illness to that time in 1769. But his friend, who idolized him, that's John Adams, by the way. John Adams, you know, John Adams had indicated much earlier that he had been showing signs of erratic behavior. Yeah, as early as 1765, he received the gash to the head by the British tax collector in 1769. So much earlier, John Adams had indicated that he was showing signs of erratic behavior. John Adams would imagine John Adams saying somebody demonstrated erratic behavior. John Adams, of course, modern historians, acknowledge that he suffered from bipolar disorder. So did his son, John Quincy Adams. So you can imagine John Adams, actually being concerned about James Otis Jr.'s mental health, his mental state. John Adams would actually write at one point that James Otis Jr. was confused and he rambled and wandered like a ship without a helm. Right. He would also write later on in 1771 that John Adams was sorry that James Otis Jr. That's John Adams, right? That James Otis Jr. was raving mad, right? He'd gone raving mad. And was raving against father, against wife, against brother, against sister, against friend, right? So that's they said that James Otis had gone raving mad, and they said he was just demonstrating confusion. But it's unfortunate what happened to him. The speculation is that he became erratic, right? Due to they speculate that he probably had syphilis, right? That he probably had syphilis. I'll get around to that again. He had syphilis, and also he battled with alcoholism. So his condition, his mental health, was exacerbated by his drinking, his alcoholism. And of course, they say much later on that the gash, the injury, severe injury to the head by the British tax collector who hit him with a cudgel to the head, that may have exacerbated his mental illness. Now, in terms of the syphilis, I find it very, very interesting because he was married, right? He was actually married to an heiress. He married Ruth Conyngham, who had inherited a fortune of £10,000. £10,000 in 1755 when he married her is the equivalent of over 3,900,000 and over 3.9 million dollars, right? Well over $3.9 million in 2024 money, right? So that's a fortune, still a lot of money. So she inherited that, brought it to his household. So it's interesting that if he had syphilis, his wife did die 6 years after him, and I find it kind of interesting that prominent men who have, you know, it's been speculated suffered from syphilis, like Al Capone. They had wives. We don't hear of the mental states or the whatever condition of the wives. We hear of the men who had dementia. Al Capone, of course, had dementia from his syphilis, but his wife still lived. Al Capone was married, right? Al Capone's wife survived him by 39 years, right? 39 years, still lived on 39 years after his death. That's Al Capone's wife. Um, James Otis Jr.'s wife survived him by 6 years. So it's interesting, that they say James Otis Jr. possibly had syphilis. They said most likely had syphilis. I was one of the reasons for his severe mental illness. Of course, syphilis wasn't treatable at that time. Um, but regardless, he was a very brilliant man. He, like I said, he went to Harvard, and he actually wrote a lot of papers. Unfortunately, he burned majority of his papers close to the end of his life. He started burning them, the majority. But there were many that he left that, like the rudiments of Latin prosody, right, which became as it was adapted as a textbook at Harvard, right? Of course, he graduated from Harvard, the rudiments of Latin prosody. He was a brilliant orator, and he mentored a lot of people. He also wrote The Rights of the British Colonies. In The Rights of the British Colonies, it's considered a masterpiece, a seminal work. It's interesting, his ideas at that time, prior to the revolution. He actually argued in favor of that African Americans, that's blacks, then had inalienable rights as well, right? That they had inalienable rights, and that he argued in favor of them having rights to uh, life, liberty, and property as well. Uh, you know, he argued that blacks, that people in the British colonies were, were freeborn, regardless of if they were white or black. So he had groundbreaking ideas at the time, revolutionary for his times, with respect to the rights and equality of black Americans. And so he argued for the equality, racial equality at that time, of course, which was groundbreaking, which was very revolutionary, at that time. That was not what a lot of the prominent uh, founding fathers thought of. Least of all, the author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. By the way, I'm right. Historians are in agreement that James Otis Jr. was the first founding father with severe mental illness. I guess because his career was destroyed, was cut short because of severe mental illness. But many of our founding fathers, were eccentric. Like Thomas Jefferson. But they don't say he had a mental illness. But Thomas Jefferson was known to have been eccentric, right? He would receive guests in the White House when he became president in flip flops, right, and slippers. He always had he actually had a bird on his shoulder, sitting a mockingbird that sat on his shoulder, and he would feed his bird from food that was in his mouth, right? He'd use food that was in his mouth to directly feed his mockingbird. So, he was eccentric, and the way he kept his hair at the time, the way he dressed, it was unusual for those times. But uh, James Otis Jr., as John Adams said, was raving mad, right? They called him raving mad, unfortunately. But nevertheless, he still influenced a lot of people, and many people who became very prominent. And his family, by the way, was very prominent. He influenced the cousin of course, John Adams, the rabble rouser Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams went on to become governor of Massachusetts, and of course, um, he got a bear named after him, Samuel Adams, right? So he also influenced a woman called Susanna Haswell Rosen. She went on to become the first female geographer, and also she went on to be the first best-selling novelist in the colonies before Beecher, uh, Harriet Beecher's, is it Stowe Beecher or Beecher Stowe? Her Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Susanna Rosen is considered the first best-selling novelist in America. She was born in England. I'm going to do something because I'm reading her novel, right? The novel she wrote, Charlotte Temple. Uh, you know, a Tale of Truth, Charlotte Temple. I'm reading it and I'm going to discuss it. I want to discuss, that novel, Charlotte Temple. So Susanna Rosen was taught by um, um, James Otis Jr. James Otis Jr. was a family friend of her father, and he took a special interest in her education. So he educated her, and she, of course, became a brilliant novelist. She did many different things as well. So I'm going to discuss her novel in a different video, Charlotte Temple, which is very interesting. So James Otis Jr., uh, very brilliant founding father. Unfortunately, he's considered the first founding father to have suffered a severe mental illness, which disrupted his political career, which actually uh, destroyed his political career. On May 23, 1783, while standing in the doorway of his friend's home, he was struck by lightning and he died. It's interesting. His home, even though his wife, he was a patriot and his wife was a loyalist, but she remained loyal to him until his death. She never left him, but she was a British loyalist. His life is also his home was also an example of how the patriots, how the early Americans, colonists were split. Homes were divided between loyalists to the British Crown and patriots, people who were loyalists to the revolution, right? Who favored the revolution. I've talked about Benjamin Franklin, how his son, his son who'd been a governor, royal governor of New Jersey, he remained a British loyalist, and he died in England, went off over to England. He had initially been incarcerated by the Revolution Continental Army, the revolutionary forces for a long time. And in the case of James Otis Jr., one of his daughters married was a loyalist, right? Like his wife. One of his daughters was a loyalist, and she married a captain in the British Army, and she uh, went over to England, and lived the rest of her life in England. Uh, James Otis Jr. would disinherit her, right? He would disinherit her, but he had another daughter who married a guy called Benjamin Lincoln. Benjamin Lincoln was actually the son of a distinguished Continental Army general, right? The Continental Army, that was the forces. Those were the forces. That was the army of the Patriots, right? The Patriots, the revolutionaries, the Americans who were fighting the British. Our military forces were called the Continental Army. So General Benjamin Lincoln is also relevant in that he was one who he put down the Shays, one of the generals who put down the Shays Rebellion. The Shays Rebellion in 1787 was the reaction against taxes, right, in Western Massachusetts, right, after the war. It was a reaction against taxes in Western Massachusetts. So that's the life of our first founding father who suffered a severe mental illness which destroyed his political career, and that's James Otis Jr. My name is Oloroti Milsha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.